The three boys bounded through the grass towards the forest, a spray of panicky hoppers glimmering around them, while John Henry recited the passage from Scouting for Boys that approved the adventure. He nodded when he reached the end. Mary fixed her eyes on the children, one arm raised to block the late morning sun. "They've never gone so far on their own." "George wants responsibility." John Henry smiled at his wife. "We should encourage him." "7's no age for responsibility, John." Nor, she thought, old enough to shepherd a 6 and a 4-year-old, neither of whom could walk unsupervised to their bedroom at night without veering off to investigate some amusing distraction. An insect, a thud. But she bit her tongue, for fear the scouts had something to say about that, too. Mary watched her boys slow their pace and enter the forest, lifting their hands and knees as though wading into cold sea. In a blink they were gone, indistinguishable from the dark mess of pine trees, discarded branches, and spiky undergrowth. The Davenport family stayed at Half Moon Lake in July. Their Louisiana lake house was smaller than their home in Opelousas, but still impressive. 2 stories, pale blue, with slate-gray shutters, white trim, a wide porch, and a balcony off the main bedroom. The house sat 500 yards from the lake, which was fringed on 3 sides by forest, at the top of a clearing, providing the Davenports a dress-circle view and unimpeded access to the water. Here, Mary woke to birdsong and the smell of fresh-baked ginger cake, and later played piano while the drawing-room curtains swelled on the breeze. John Henry took breakfast with his wife, read the St. Landry Clarion, the Atlantic Monthly, Outdoor Life, the latest Picayune, then worked on plans to further expand his business. The Davenport boys, George, Paul, and Sonny, watched by Nanny Nellie, spent their days playing cowboys and Indians, chasing dun-colored rabbits, and kicking a ball to one another. In the afternoons, John Henry instructed them in an aspect of scoutcraft. This summer day was muggy, but oak trees surrounding the house offered enough shade that John Henry, Mary, and their guests, Ira and Gladys Heaton, and Gladys's mother, Mrs. Billingham, would sit outside, as John Henry preferred. "Perhaps air will ease my headaches. Now that my daughter has declared my homeopathics quackery, I'm left to suffer without relief." Mrs. Billingham fanned herself. "You know the pastilles help. There's no reason to resist every modernity." Gladys turned to Mary. "Eucalyptus and cocaine. They work wonders." "Without any relief at all." As the group enjoyed their sweet tea, bees harvested nearby crepe myrtle trees, and hummingbirds flew from foxgloves to hollyhocks in search of nectar. The Davenport boys had joined the adults for a while that morning, squatting near the woodpile with their toy soldiers, unobserved, Nanny Nellie having been permitted a rare afternoon and evening off to visit her mother, until they'd grown restless and begged to go exploring. "In search of what?" Mrs. Billingham asked. "Life's compass," John Henry replied. The men discussed business. John Henry's furniture manufacturing company had sold 1,000 chairs in the past 18 months, and Ira Heaton's stationery company had secured a significant government contract. Gladys chattered about millinery, bemoaned her rust-red hair, envied Mary's glossy blackness. Mary worried about the boys. She feigned interest when Gladys, holding up an open copy of the Delineator, said, "Here's the ribbon, I mean," and offered a sympathetic murmur when Mrs. Billingham confided that the pastilles made her pulse race. When she went indoors, ostensibly to check with Cook that she'd remembered Mrs. Billingham's aversion to pepper, Mary shared her concern with her housekeeper, Esmeralda. What if the boys meet with fire ants, snakes, alligators? Esmeralda folded her hands over her dusting cloth. "Mr. Davenport's taught them how to behave in the outdoors. They won't come to harm." "There's no behavior that fends off an alligator aside from firing a rifle," Mary said, though Esmeralda had, as always, calmed her. At noon, as John Henry led Ira to the library to show him a recently acquired map of Peru, the women strolled in the garden, and John Henry's butler, Mason, pulled on his boots to go fetch the boys. George and Paul Davenport walked up the hill without their brother. Mary stopped by the rose bushes. Gladys and Mrs. Billingham followed suit. "George," Mary said, "where's Sonny? We thought maybe he'd be here." "Why would you think that?" Mrs. Billingham tisked. "We looked every other place, shouted and whistled. He's no good at hiding, except this time. Dropped hop, though." Paul held Sonny's toy rabbit aloft by its threadbare arm. "I said we'd name him the winner. Only had to show himself," George said. "It's true he said that." "Where is he, then?" Mary's voice quickened. Behind her, Gladys placed her fingertips on her mother's arm. "Don't know," Paul shrugged. Mary looked across the grassy expanse and glaring lake to the forest. Nothing moved. She grabbed Paul's wrist and pushed George's shoulder to turn him around. "Inside, now," she called for John Henry as she hurried the boys up the front steps. Sonny wasn't in the garden. He wasn't in the thickets or on the rope swing or in the shed. And though John Henry and Iris scoured the forest and lake's edge with Mason, they didn't find the boy. While the adults searched, George and Paul sat on the porch steps, forbidden by Mary from moving 1 inch. "He's hiding to get us into trouble," Paul said to Esmeralda. George waved a fly from his face. "You don't know anything." "I know I'm hungry." "Hush, both of you." Esmeralda twisted a tie of her apron until it coiled. "Left your brother out there alone. Should be ashamed of yourselves." Mary circled the house, frantic, ran inside to hunt in closets, beneath beds and behind doors, a ring of blackened linen flapping about her ankles. When she knelt on the steps and shook George, demanding he tell her again every word Sonny had said, reducing the boy to tears, Mrs. Billingham insisted Mary lie down. Esmeralda served ham sandwiches and pastries, made a pot of coffee, and, at Gladys's instruction, added a generous dash of brandy for Mrs. Davenport. "No, no, no," Mary said. "No." "There's no cause for alarm," Mrs. Billingham counseled. "John Henry will find the child." But when she could, Mrs. Billingham suggested that Ira drive into town to alert the sheriff. "The boy's only been missing a few hours," Ira said. "He's probably off frightening small creatures or digging a hole." "Digging a hole? Is that what you think children do?" Mrs. Billingham stared meaningfully at the motor car. Alone in the dark forest, his heart thundering, John Henry looked for signs of his son's passage. Crushed leaves, broken branches, blood. Chapter 2. At 6 o'clock, Ira returned from Opelousas with Sheriff Sherman and 3 of his men. Everyone rushed out to meet the cars. In the overlapping introductions and activity, Cook being told to bring tea, Mason offering his assistance, the men adjusting dusty hats and clammy shirts, Esmeralda glaring at Paul to silence his cheep of "Mister, Mister," the sheriff stood, straight-backed and speckless, as though in the eye of a storm. John Henry stepped forward to shake the sheriff's hand, noted his healthy solidity, glints of white in chestnut hair, the thoughtful narrowing of his eyes as he scanned the surroundings, the unforced kindness in his voice when he spoke to Mary. "My deputy's coming with dogs, and we have a few hours light. We'll find him." He pointed 2 of his men towards the woods and 1 to the house. "You've been to the resort?" he asked John Henry. "Surely that's too far." "Not if he cut across the hill. I think it's worth talking to them." Once his men had scattered and John Henry and Ira had driven off, the sheriff turned to George and Paul, who were still flanking Esmeralda. "Now," he said as he crouched down, "how about you tell me exactly what happened out there?" The Starry Lake Resort was 1 mile east of the Davenports' half-moon home by road, but less, as the sheriff said, if Sonny had clambered over the hills. So John Henry and Ira sped down the shaded road, past cotton fields and run-down farmhouses, towards the resort, where they'd usually comment on dim-witted landowners being stuck on old ways, the increasing number of cattle falling to disease, or the frustration of managing Negro workers. They stayed silent. The resort catered to the area's wealthiest citizens. Membership was by invitation, referral, or bequest. During the past year, the outside walls and columns had been painted, and the cedar ceilings, marble mantels, and oriental carpets revived. Tennis courts were added. Local newspapers followed the progress of the renovation. Families picnicked outside the grounds, and the children of local lumbermen stared through the curlicued metal gates. The resort had reopened with fanfare in May, promising an elegant atmosphere reminiscent of the glory days of the South before the war. When the afternoons were dry and not too hot, wasp-waisted ladies wearing slippery silk and long strands of pearls ambled beneath magnolia trees, while men of influence stroked their whiskers and discussed the issues of the day: workers' strikes in England, the trouble in the Balkans, Colonel Gracie's new book, The Truth About the Titanic, a second example, following The Truth About Chickamauga, of his talent for rendering thrilling events dreary. Gracie's recent death noted, then ignored. They discussed how to assist one another's endeavors, too. At night, when the wind blew the right way, birch trees shimmied music from the resort through the forest to the Davenport living room. Mary closed her eyes and listened, imagining dancing couples lit by crystal chandeliers, while John Henry stewed about the conversations taking place without him. Important people made important decisions at Starry Lake Resort. For too long, he'd dismissed the resort as inconsequential. But his friend Judge Roy insisted otherwise, and promised he'd nominate John Henry next month. John Henry had ambitious plans, and membership at the resort would be key to their success. It had never been part of John Henry's plans to stand on the dirt driveway and rattle those formidable gates in frustration, shouting out for entry to the resort to search for his son. Yet there he was. Ira Heaton pressed his car horn again, stopping at the sight of a dumpy man with a scowl plodding across the lawn towards them. John Henry's first encounter with the resort lacked dignity, but he hoped at least the gates would be opened for him. The man spat tobacco on the ground. "Members only." Speaking through the bars, John Henry told his story, describing Sonny, and making sure the man understood, if he didn't already from John Henry and Ira's appearance, that he was unaccustomed to being denied entry anywhere. The man lifted one shoulder in a shrug. "I'll keep an eye out, and ask in the kitchen and laundry who's come and gone. We get a lot of deliveries. Could be someone offered him a ride." As John Henry walked back to the car, Ira stepped closer to the gate. "You understand that is the very opposite of reassurance." "Wasn't aware coddling strangers was part of my job." Word traveled that a boy had gone missing at Half Moon Lake, and people from surrounding towns, farms, and even a docked showboat volunteered to help. They searched the chapel and school, asked around in local stores. In no time at all, 100 men, glad of summer's late light, were spread across the landscape, occasionally raising their hats to wipe their brows with kerchiefs, whacking sticks through the undergrowth, sending grass seeds and mosquitoes into the air. Some rode on twitchy horses, cradling shotguns. Snuffling hounds ran diagonals in front of them. A beady-eyed tanner called Jackson Lane found small footprints beside the railway tracks, and the searchers swooped, like a flock of starlings, up the hill and into the drier woodland above the lake where the trains cut through. The sheriff told one of the younger searchers to run back to the house and fetch Sonny's sandals. "Ask the housekeeper, not the mother, and mind your manners." When the boy returned, breathless and sweaty, the sheriff held the sandals next to the prints. The men craned into a circle and saw the prints were, yes, the right size. Nobody could agree on why the prints petered out. "He's been taken," Jackson said. "Lifted onto a train." "Then why's there no grown man's footprints? You saying somebody strong enough to just reach out and swoop him up from a moving train?" one man asked. "Impossible," John Henry said. "There's no train today," another chimed in. "Freight trains go slower," Jackson said. The sheriff held one hand up to silence the men. "I've told you twice to back off. Y'all hard of hearing?" John Henry exhaled loudly. Ignoring the sheriff's instructions, the men had stomped around the prints, snapping twigs and squashing Indian grass, making and perhaps destroying leads. His own children knew better. Sheriff Sherman asked his deputy to drive to the station master's house to get the schedule, but he was clearly skeptical of Jackson's theory. Even a beanpole like you couldn't reach out that far from a train, no matter the speed. All through the night, searchers came into the house in waves, trudging up the hill under a starry sky with only a sliver of moon. The men smelled of whiskey, pine smoke, and salty sweat, and lay down in the kitchen and dining room on make-do bedding brought in by the ladies' aid. Esmeralda spread Hessian sacks on the ground for the dogs. The symphony of snores, hound and human, croaking frogs, hooting owls, and music from the resort made the house thrum. The sounds carried to the Davenports' bedroom, where John Henry slouched for a brief rest in a chair by the window, and Mary wept and slept, shook, then sat numb, clutching Sonny's toy rabbit. Down the hallway, George and Paul sat cross-legged on their beds in the dark. "He's too chicken to be out at night," George said. "Unless he's really lost, or you said something to make him stay there. Did you say something?" "Nothing bad," Paul whispered. "What did you say?" Chapter 3. The following afternoon, Tom McCabe and Eddie Dale arrived at the lake. "Wish he'd let us come out earlier." Eddie dropped his cigarette to the ground and stubbed it out with his heel. "You've got plenty of time to get your pictures," Tom said. "Spoken like a writer." Tom surveyed the scene, taking in the army of men, the exhausted dogs lying in packs, the glossy lake rippled from Negroes dragging heavy nets through it. He smelled the tadpoley muck of roots draped along the lake's edge, felt warmth rising up from the earth. Tom put his hands in his pockets, jiggling his lucky pennies. Then, instead of heading to the lake to get the facts from the sheriff, like he knew he should, he went to the house to find the boy's mother. It wasn't hard to figure out which woman was Mary Davenport. She sat in a white wicker chair at the front of the house, in the shade of a tree, upright and pale as a lily, ignoring the women who swooshed about her. She'd fixed her eyes on the lake. A breeze blew tendrils of fallen hair from her face, creating a clear line of sight into which Tom intruded. "Mrs. Davenport, my name's Tom McCabe. I'm a reporter at the St. Landry Clarion. I'm here with our photographer, Eddie Dale." He used his hat to point out Eddie, who'd stood his tripod near the lake. Mary looked at Tom, her attention perfunctory. "We'd like to tell our readers about your missing boy. One of them might know something." He waited. "I'm sure he'll be back home in no time, Mrs. Davenport. No time at all, but You think they'll find him soon?" Mary flicked her eyes up at Tom. Hazel, bloodshot, Tom noted, with a spray of freckles across her nose. "Do you think so?" And though he had no idea about anything, Tom said, "I'm sure of it, Mrs. Davenport." He took out his notebook and licked his pencil. "So what's Sonny like? Is he a good boy?" Tom shook his head. "Of course he is. What does he like to do? When I was a boy, I was crazy for animals. Chased chickens around the yard, rode the mule though I wasn't supposed to." Mary turned her attention back to the lake. "I have a dog now, Mrs. Davenport. He's named Walter. He's a terrific dog. Does Sonny like dogs?" "Sonny loves dogs. He begs his father for one." Her voice softened. "When Sonny's found, I'll tell him he can have a dog. Anyone he likes." "I'll bet you will. And what boy wouldn't love that?" Esmeralda came out of the house and shooed Tom away. "Mrs. Davenport needs quiet." Tom didn't like being spoken to that way by a Negro, but neither Mary nor her attendants reprimanded Esmeralda. Tom dipped his head to Mary and walked down the hill to Eddie, who was pulling himself out from under his camera cloth. "This is Jackson Lane." Eddie nodded at the man in front of his lens. "You'll want to talk to him. He found a clue." "And I can, too, reach a boxcar from there," Jackson said. "Lay down and tested it." "Bully for you," Tom muttered, and rolled his eyes at Eddie. How many times had he told him to steer clear of the crazies? A dozen yards away, John Henry boomed out instructions to the Negroes standing thigh-deep in the lake. Out of the corner of his eye, Tom saw Mary stride towards her husband. He hoped she didn't say a reporter had planted ideas in her head about a dog. If he wanted to get the story, he'd need to win over all the players. But there was something telling. As Mary moved closer to John Henry, he turned, sensing her, and his hand and hers rose up and reached out through the air for its mate. As the sun dropped behind the hills, the lake changed color from moss green to fleshy pink, purple, resting at black. Slow-moving searchers made fires and lit lanterns. Smoke whirled against the spangled sky, and amber firelight cast strange shadows on the men's faces. To John Henry, watching from the porch, the scene resembled a Bible school painting, a hell of barking dogs, black men, and wild flames, in which his boy wandered, lost. Local women shuttled chicken, yams, and corn to the trestle tables set up on the lawn and put a tray out for leftovers to give to the colored men. John Henry was close enough to hear the women talking to one another, blending practical and personal comments, sharing anecdotes. All of this to an unseemly score of ragtime tunes drifting out from the resort. It was remarkable to John Henry how quickly an abnormal situation had become normalized, how by the second night there were systems in place for eating and sleeping. He approved of the methodical intelligence of it, but struggled to control his rising panic. None of this noisy industry had yielded anything, but it would. It must. Meanwhile, Mrs. Billingham stood at the living room window, one hand holding back the heavy curtain so she could watch. "I'm certain they haven't put out enough food," she said to Gladys, then abandoned her post to collapse into the nearest armchair. "But I'll spend what energy I have caring for Mary." She rubbed her worked wrist. "What an awful ordeal." "So awful. I do hope they find him soon." Mrs. Billingham glanced at Mary, who had unintentionally consumed enough alcohol to fall asleep on the sofa, her face squashed into a cushion, another skirt ruined. "Ring the bell, Gladys. I'll have Esmeralda help Mary to her room." Gladys was tapping her boot in time to what she could hear of the distant Joplin tune. "Gladys!" Yes. Gladys, pouting, walked across the room and rang the bell. "Another night ruined because of one naughty boy. I'm not sure I ever want children." "Tell me," George insisted, again. It was too hot to sleep. They knelt on the wooden floor, side by side, and stuck their heads out the window in the hope of seeing some of the action, but the backyard was empty. Paul folded his arms on the sill. "What does it matter? They'll look for him anyhow. Just tell me." Knowing that George would keep at him like a woodpecker, Paul gave in. "I told him he wasn't our brother, that we were only letting him stay till his real family came back from a war, and then he'd have to go live with them in the north, and we'd never see him again, and good riddance because I was sick of him following me like a bad smell." "What war?" "I made that up." "You made all of it up." George punched his brother in the arm. "Idiot." "I didn't know he'd run off forever." Paul's eyes filled with tears. "Do you think he's okay?" "No, he can't even buckle his shoes." George stood up. "I'm telling Pa." "Don't. It won't make any difference." George figured this was probably true. The adults would search for Sonny until they found him, no matter what Paul had said. And if Paul admitted he'd scared Sonny, he'd be made to sit alone and think about what he'd done, banned from playing games, and George would be left with nothing to do. That wouldn't be fair. He glared at his brother. "You've done a lot of dumb things, but this is the dumbest." Chapter 4. Thick clouds covered the sky, and heavy midsummer rain fell, making the search harder. Day after day, men trod across gummy mud and slippery grass and sought to keep memories of comfortable beds at bay. If there'd been other footprints, they were washed away, along with any scent of the boy. Without a doable task, the dogs became fretful and undisciplined, chased squirrels darting for cover, played deaf to their owner's calls. Bill O'Sullivan's setter was snatched by an alligator when the dog padded too close to the water's edge, nose down, not seeing the serpentine eyes in the lake's pocked surface. Bill shot at the gator as it yanked his fine-boned setter into the lake, but in a flash there was nothing to shoot at, other than trampolining water. Men came from Crowley, Alexandria, and Baton Rouge. Each train that stopped near Half Moon Lake collected sodden searchers to return them home and delivered a fresh batch of helpers. When the train stopped for the night, the men slept on floors and in canvas tents, the colored men taking shelter from the rain on the back porch. But the searchers found nothing, not a trace of Sonny Davenport aside from that one set of vanished prints. The reporters who milled around the muddy patch where the footprints had been discovered, now marked by a flagged stick, agreed it would take a giant of a man to reach that far from a moving train. "Unless," Tom whispered to Eddie, "he wasn't on a train." Eddie raised his eyebrows. "Could be our man was on a horse, walking the tracks, knowing he'd hear a train if one came. Lot of scrub and uneven ground up here, except on the tracks. Sees the boy. Easy enough to help him onto a horse, tempt him with a ride home. A horse wouldn't like those rocks between the sleepers. Maybe the boy was walking the tracks by himself. That wouldn't leave prints either." "Less likely, I'd say." Tom had already fashioned horse-related headlines and didn't want Eddie messing with his percolating theory. The sheriff had his men interview the guests, staff, musicians, and suppliers who'd passed in and out of the resort on that day. He contacted station masters along the train line and extended the foot search 10 miles in every direction. He sent for Indian trackers, regretting he hadn't done so before the rain. And he reluctantly told John Henry about a possibility closer to home. "It might be that an alligator's taken him. Wouldn't be the first time around here." John Henry nodded. "I know." The sheriff didn't mention Bill O'Sullivan's dog. He only wanted John Henry to be clear about why he'd instructed his men to blast the lake. The ground shook as men threw sticks of dynamite into the water. The blasts brought scores of stunned and dead catfish, crappie, and bass to the surface. A tree was uprooted and drifted across the lake, its branches wafting about like hair. Each time a whole alligator floated to the top, belly up, tangled in hyacinth, the men dragged it onto land and sliced it open with care. They cut through the armored back and dug into the creature's carcass, pushing muddy fingers into organs and around muscle, feeling for any trace of the boy. Shredded clothing, human bones, while being mindful of how much the skin would be worth once they determined who had the right to sell it. In the quiet between booms, people shouted to one another and whistled to wayward dogs. The men's numbers grew to 200. The manager of the Starry Lake Resort, more understanding than the groundskeeper, dispatched another dozen members of his ground staff. The Davenports' friends sent their servants to assist. Gladys and Mrs. Billingham stayed on and had their maids travel from Opelousas to tend to their needs. Half Moon Lake had never seen so many people. They would find him. The reporter had assured Mary of that again yesterday when she'd snuck downstairs for relief from her room and the endless, unhelpful visitors. He'd asked if he could join her on the porch, then leapt up the steps 2 at a time like Paul did. She'd almost smiled. "Mrs. Davenport?" He lifted his hat an inch above his head. "I'm sorry, Tom McCabe, and you owe me no apology. This isn't any way to make a person's acquaintance." He'd glanced toward the open front door. "I'd wager it's crowded in there, too. You have a lot of friends, Mrs. Davenport." "Oh, I don't know these people. I'm grateful for their help, of course." "Of course." He'd lowered his voice. "Not everyone is as helpful as they'd like to believe in these situations, though." At that, she had smiled. "Are you helpful, Mr. McCabe?" "I sure am. A good reporter is part bowerbird, part bloodhound. There's many a time a reporter has solved a case before the detective." "Is that so?" she'd said, as though they were at a party, making playful conversation. "I wonder if Sheriff Sherman knows that." Uttering the sheriff's name had sobered Mary, and she'd fallen silent. "Mrs. Davenport," Tom had said, in a tone determined to reassure, "there are hundreds of men out there now. Whole acres of brawn and brain. There's no doubt they'll find him." Mary lay in bed, as unable to sleep as her boys, replaying her conversation with Tom McCabe. John Henry had brought the doctor from Opelousas that morning, and though he'd come armed with medicines for anxiety and insomnia, Mary refused to take them. She wanted to be alert when Sonny was found. So many unfamiliar sounds filled her house this evening. She could pick out Esmeralda's steadfast clomp up and down the stairs, the insistent ringing of the living room bell, the ceaseless opening and closing of doors. But there were voices she didn't recognize, men on the porch, women in the hall. There was a braying horse, metal clanks, and was that Gladys singing? Rain hammered down so relentlessly that Mary imagined the roof collapsing onto her, a wet crash of wood and slate. She pictured water streaming through her room and down the hill, gouging into the earth, filling the lake. The thought of this watery chaos, of Sonny outside in this monstrous weather, was too awful. She slapped the bedspread with one hand, Hop in the other, and pushed herself up. Mary walked to the mantel to stare again at the photograph of Sonny in an oval brass frame. He'd enjoyed having his picture taken, the only one of the three who did. George had tolerated it, as always showing serious forbearance. Paul had fidgeted and fussed, complained about the tedium of so much sitting. Sonny had grinned, more than John Henry had wanted for this family record, but she'd winked at her son, encouraged him. Why wasn't there more of him, she thought. A picture, clothes, a toy rabbit. That wasn't enough. She'd had to part with the photograph for 2 days. The sheriff wanted the newspapers to use the one picture and written description. Otherwise, they take unhelpful liberties, he'd explained. Mary and John Henry had drafted Sonny's description together, giving rise to the worst disagreement they'd had since his disappearance. When they'd recalled the origin of Sonny's unique feature, a curved scar above his elbow, wide in the middle, from being yanked out of the birth canal by forceps, Mary became angry about the scar Paul sported on his arm from an irresponsible, Mary's word, unfortunate, John Henry's, lesson in whittling. Later, the sheriff told them he'd omit the detail of Sonny's scar in any case, saying to Mary that he often withheld one piece of information to check for hucksters, and then, to John Henry, that it was a mark easily added to a child's arm by unscrupulous criminals hoping for a reward. They described Sonny instead as having his mother's almond eyes and rosy cheeks, with fair hair and all his teeth, a shorter build than some boys of his age, but still robust. Mary wanted to add cheerful, but the men pointed out, gently, that under the circumstances that might not be the case. Sonny was her favorite. Each of the others had held that title for a while, then lost it. She'd been besotted with George because he was the first, and such a happy baby. But once he could talk, John Henry became his teacher, and the boy grew so clever so quickly it alarmed her. George didn't mean to rattle her with his hungry intelligence, but Mary no longer felt easy in her role. Her warmth seemed childish, her authority shaky. George became his father's son. Then Paul had arrived, a rascal from the start. He'd adored her without restraint, but lately he'd become defiant and argumentative. Sonny's birth had been the easiest, since the doctor brought chloroform. She'd passed out instantly, felt no pain. The miracle of medicine, the doctor had said. After the birth, he'd encouraged Mary to drink French tonics when she fed Sonny. They'd both been relaxed for months, and that sweet comfort had stayed between them. Mary stood at the bedroom window, resting her forehead on the glass. The clouds obscured whatever stars there might have been, and the fires were wet ash. There wasn't enough light for her to tell if any men were out in the rain, but the longer Mary stared, the more she saw pulsing dark spots, inexplicable movement. Was Sonny watching from afar, teaching his brothers a lesson for some infraction they were refusing to admit? It wasn't as though she hadn't grilled George and Paul. And unless Sonny was injured or trapped, it wasn't too far from forest to house. Where was he? When he could, John Henry read aloud to distract his wife. Mary enjoyed reading, but now couldn't muster the concentration, and her eyes stung from crying. At first, he read from the Clarion about the Gettysburg reunion, which had brought 50,000 men to the site. But Mary curled into a ball on her bed and sobbed that Sonny would have loved that tale. So John Henry abandoned the newspaper in favor of Muir's The Yosemite, hoping the steady describing of rocks and streams, irised waterfalls, forests of silver fir would soothe her as it did him. And from the eastern boundary of this vast golden flower bed rose the mighty Sierra, miles in height, and so gloriously colored and so radiant, it seemed not clothed with light, but wholly— "How long until they find him, John? It's been 7 days." John Henry placed his book on the side table. "Soon, my love. There's no chance he'll remain undiscovered for much longer." As he pushed himself up from the chair, Mary lurched across the bed. "He's alone!" She gripped his arm. 7 days alone! Once John Henry had coaxed his wife to sleep, with the aid of the doctor's alkaloids, he sat, again, in the nearest armchair to watch her. He rested one hand on the books piled next to him. Thoreau, Longfellow, Emerson. If he could choose, he'd summon Emerson for company. Thoreau was an impressive naturalist, and John Henry could almost admire the rigor he showed in abstaining from tobacco, alcohol, and meat, and salt. But Thoreau's rejection of companionship was troubling. The man was a misanthrope, and he had no children. Best he remain on the page. Longfellow was too emotional to give sturdy comfort to another. Emerson would understand. Devastated by the deaths of his first wife and one of his sons, he'd emerged wise and empathetic. Emerson was a man John Henry would like to sit with now. In reality, though, he was as good as alone. John Henry was aware that his readings and the doctor's medicines could only do so much for his wife. He sent for Father Clement. Mary had never warmed to the priest. "He barely notices I'm standing beside you." But John Henry knew he'd deliver assurance of a kind no one else could. And since the Davenports had unfailingly attended his 10 o'clock Mass for years, married in his original church, and contributed generously to the building of its impressive replacement, he assumed his request would not go ignored. He was right. Father Clement arrived at Half Moon Lake the same day he was bidden. Mary tolerated several hour-long visits before imploring her husband to keep the priest away. "He speaks nothing but platitudes." "He speaks God's word." "I pray every day for God's help. My palms are all but welded together. Can I not speak with him directly? I'm unconvinced Father Clement prays as urgently as I, or—"
"Mary, stop."
"You know he wants more money for his German stained-glass windows."
"He did mention that."
"I don't need him as emissary of my message, John. If he'll pray for Sonny's return, then good. I beg he asks the entire congregation to do so as well, but let me pray on my own." Mrs. Billingham and Gladys ministered to Mary, too, under instruction from John Henry not to offer opinion or update. Gladys brushed Mary's hair and chatted about the interesting items in her magazines. Mrs. Billingham rang the bell for dry pillow slips and sweet tea, scented Mary's handkerchiefs with lavender oil, and ensured the servants didn't become lazy. The women listened as, during her lucid moments, Mary worried about how hungry Sonny would be, how frightened, then railed against Nanny Nellie's thoughtlessness.
"For her to have spent the night away when you needed her, it's appalling," Mrs. Billingham sniffed. "Why haven't you dismissed her?"
"Oh, I couldn't do without her. No, I need to remind her that her loyalty is to us. That's what I need to do."
Mrs. Billingham examined an itchy spot on her thumb. "If you think that's best."
When Mary did take the doctor's formulations, she slept, but woke hot and bilious, and suffered baffling dreams of the bayou near her childhood home. Not Half Moon Lake in the sunshine, not her favorite picnic spot near Spearmint Pond, not the banks of the Mississippi, not any other pleasing or relevant body of water, not a reunion with Sonny. Asleep, her mind clawed and yowled. She dreamed she sat on the slippery red leather seat of her family's buggy, next to her black-clad mother and facing her glowering father, as they rolled down the long road away from Arlington Grove Plantation. She felt the cool shadows as the buggy passed beneath thick trees, then the slowed trot of the horses, the horses slowing, though Thomas never asked them to, as they entered the bayou, a place so different from the airy flats around their plantation. Here the greens were darker, the plants gnarled. The cypress trees in the bayou were draped with moss. Algae and reeds fringed the edges of the water. Armies of insects buzzed loudly enough to be heard over the rattling wheels. Mary wished her father would stop the buggy and let her go to the soupy water's edge, where the alligators lived. She'd seen a quick whip of tail going underwater, marble eyes floating on the surface, but never the whole creature. She'd heard their bellow and hiss. The idea of an animal so hideous thrilled her, but neither in life nor in her dreams did she ask her father to stop. When Mary dreamed of this swampland, so many years and miles away, she woke gulping for air. Lying in the dark, she tried to take her mind elsewhere, to muster the quiet resolve her husband prized and needed from her. Because who did he have? Who did she have, if they were to fail one another? Chapter 5. On day 8, John Henry and Sheriff Sherman drove to the nearby cotton mill.
"What we want to check," the sheriff explained, "is that Jack Knowles hasn't scooped him up and put him to work. He's 4 years old."
But as John Henry walked the aisles of Knowles' mill, between rows of deafening steel machinery, all moving at rapid-fire speed and without guardrails or shields, he understood the ignorance of his remark. There were dozens of children working in the hot, airless factory, and few of them had been alive long enough to hit double digits.
"How is he getting away with this?"
John Henry asked, his booming voice rising above the clatter.
"These children are far too young for factory jobs." "Not uncommon, though I share your opinion," the sheriff answered loudly in kind. 10-hour days are too long, and this is dangerous work. Can't you do something to stop it?"
John Henry watched as a slip of a boy, 6 at most, climbed on a spinning frame to grab at a flapping broken thread, his blackened fingers darting in and out between the metal rollers. The sheriff guided them towards a quieter section of the plant.
"We've cleared out the youngest ones 3 times in as many months. Did the same in the mine, the wood mill. But the minute we leave, they flood right back in again. It's like sweeping water out of a river." He stopped. "How do you run your factory?"
"I'd never dream of employing children this young."
"Well, poorer folks around here encourage it. It gets harder to judge when you know some of these young'uns are supporting their whole family."
He bent down to pick up a shard of green glass.
"You didn't work when you were a boy?"
John Henry blushed.
"Huh, lucky you."
The 2 men passed spinners, ravelers, loopers, doffers removing bobbins and spindles from whining frames, children working barefoot and bandaged, but none of them was Sonny. And each of the children said the same thing. They'd seen no unfamiliar boy, accompanied or otherwise, in the mill. "Most likely a tramp took him," a young girl offered, her patched pinafore straining across her chest, her hair in a thin braid that hung between her shoulder blades. "Most likely," a tall boy in 2 short pants next to her agreed. Sheriff Sherman assured John Henry there was no most likely about anything.
"Problem is, if anyone does see a tramp with your boy, it might not register. Hobos make use of strays all the time. Having a child in tow makes folks more inclined to open their barn for the night."
He pushed on the heavy factory door, letting in a welcome gust of fresh air.
"Decent folks, that is."
Their time in the cotton mill rattled John Henry, not only because some of the children were Sonny's age, but also because he felt naive. His extensive reading and solid education were not enough to overcome the limitations of his life experience, and he could think of no quick fix or pithy quote to reduce his discomfort. On day 9, John Henry and the sheriff drove even further, out to the Conroy Brothers sawmill.
"If someone stole your boy, or persuaded him to travel with them, 15 miles is not so far, and like Knowles, the Conroys aren't strangers to trouble."
The sheriff steered the car off the main road onto a rutted track that ran parallel with the train line. Neither of the Conroy brothers was at their mill, but the site manager perched on a stool in the shack said the sheriff and John Henry could talk to the men, so long as they didn't keep them from their work. He whistled out the open window for a boy, then sent him to find out if anybody knew the whereabouts of the Mr. Conroys.
"In town, I guess," the manager said to the sheriff and John Henry, "though I couldn't say for sure. Well, I'm going to take a wander around while they're doing their window shopping and what have you," the sheriff said.
While Sheriff Sherman stood in the entrance to the lot, hands on hips, considering which part of the mill to check first, John Henry walked towards the wide, muddy river, having been alerted to a passing steamboat by a sounding call. The Negro leadsman's plangent call to the pilot was functional, singing the depth of the water, but the slow, low voice stirred John Henry, tugged at a buried memory. "Mark 4, deep water. The safest kind. His father had taught him that, if little else. He gazed across the yard, noticing that here, too, young children in dirty clothes skittered in and out of buildings, carrying heavy buckets, working in pairs to push full wheelbarrows. What different lives they had from his own boys. John Henry hadn't wanted to tell the sheriff that although he'd never been to the mill, he was familiar with the Conroy name, had purchased from them. He and his business partner, Hank, bought their wood clean and planked at the market. To see it here, though, was something else. Even given the reason for their visit, and trusting the sheriff's judgment about the Conroys, John Henry couldn't help feeling some exhilaration. The sawmill was noisy and bustling, and the smell of fresh-cut wood was enlivening. He stopped at a towering pile of logs, virgin longleaf pine, heavy and durable. These were logs harvested from old-growth forests, stands treasured for their purity. He placed a hand on the coarse bark and felt a push of anger. So often he'd had to compete with northern buyers for this beautiful wood. They bought down here now, outbidding him, driving up the prices because they'd stripped bare their own forests. John Henry thought that if he owned this wood, he'd keep it in the South, yes he would. Wanting to hear what the men were saying, John Henry joined the sheriff as he walked around the mill, talking with workers at the dipping station and in the drying yard, men on breaks smoking or whittling or sharing chunks of sausage and bread. The sheriff spoke easily with them, making jokes at the Conroy's expense, then at his own uncalloused hands and starched shirt, the men wearing overalls, breeches, unpolished boots without laces, growing serious when he explained John Henry's situation. When the sheriff told him to, John Henry held up the pamphlet that bore Sonny's picture, and when he spoke, he did so slowly, for those he suspected were feeble-minded or foreign. The men seemed interested enough, but none of them knew anything about Sonny. On day 10, John Henry and Sheriff Sherman visited the clutch of cabins where the Negroes lived, near the rank swamplands where no one else would make a home. While the sheriff hadn't let the reporters follow him to the mills, he did today. They might learn something, he'd said to John Henry. The group roamed from one flimsy shack to the next, through patches of fleabane and foxtail grass, around puddles. At each house, the newsmen stood on their toes to see past the sheriff through opened doorways, keen to include details of interiors. They would describe the smell of red beans and rice, onion, pepper, catfish frying in oil, the lack of furniture, so their story would stand out from the others. At the start of the day, Sheriff Sherman had stood on a stump to tell the newsmen what he knew so far. "Listen up, ladies, because I don't want you stopping me every 20 yards with your questions. And Tom McCabe, quit jangling those coins. I can't think with that everlasting noise." "Seconded," Max from the Bugle had shouted, and they'd all laughed. Yeah, said Tom, as Eddie patted him on the back, a gesture of camaraderie rather than comfort, since anyone could see the reporters liked Tom. John Henry's and Tom's eyes had met, and they'd both smiled. John Henry was grateful for a moment's levity. Tom was glad of connection, but unnerved by the depth of sadness in John Henry's face, without any desire to do so. Since a reporter's purview was fact, not emotion, Tom felt a stab of pain knowing how much the loss of his son would wound this man. Tom wondered about John Henry's upbringing, whether he had a cruel or kind father, a warm or distant mother, siblings. John Henry wondered at Tom's combination of slouching looseness and razor-sharp attentiveness. Sheriff Sherman told the men to keep a respectful distance. Still, they inched forward when they thought they could, and then back, forward and back in waves.
"These ramshackle houses disturb me," John Henry whispered to the sheriff. "So many people in one small room, and that tar-black woman suckling a baby. She was barely clothed. I'm sure they'd live in palaces if they could. They'd be better off outdoors. Stale air poisons the blood."
John Henry looked behind him to check the reporters weren't listening in.
"Do you ever question our wisdom in having brought these people to American soil? I have no desire to vilify Negroes, but if they're not going to improve their lives now they're free, they may as well live in any country."
Sheriff Sherman stepped onto the next weather-worn porch.
"You'd send them back?"
He knocked on the door.
"That's not a terrible idea, is it, to be with one's own kind?" "Certainly not an original idea, though even Lincoln abandoned it. Guess you'd need to do the same with the Irish, the Italians, the French, the Spanish, and Germans too, the Scots, Mexicans."
He glanced back at John Henry.
"There'd be nobody home but us and the Indians, and you know they don't want us here."
A young Negro woman opened the door, a bug-eyed girl dressed in rags slung around her hip. The woman looked at the photograph and shook her head, but the sheriff asked if she could show it to the others inside. He rested against the door jamb while she did so.
"Davenport. That's English?" "Yes, long ago. I had ancestors land at Plymouth Rock. You know where I'm going with this."
When the woman returned, the sheriff dug into his pocket and handed her little girl a wrapped candy.
"A pioneer and a slave aren't remotely the same," John Henry said.
He knew that God had authored mankind's character and created the world's hierarchy in which some taught and some learned, some led and some labored. But at a certain point the onus must be on the individual to improve their circumstances.
"No argument there. I suppose that Negro child's life isn't much worse than the children at the mill,"
John Henry said as they walked to the next lean-to.
"Any one of them might choose to lead a worthier life than their parents."
The sheriff sighed.
"Choice is a rich person's word, John."
He turned to the reporters and raised his voice.
"We're done here."
After 14 days of searching, the Davenports headed back to Opelousas, despite Mary's foggy protestations, George's uncontainable tears, and Paul's violent tantrums. Gladys and Mrs. Billingham were driven home the same afternoon. The searchers and newsmen left, too. Life around the lake quieted. There'd been no sightings of the boy, and no further trace of his presence. There'd been no ransom note. And if it wasn't a kidnapping, an alligator, a wandering gone wrong, if he'd not been taken in by Negroes or Italians, the Knowles or the Conroys, then, people said, he must have been taken by a tramp. And if that were the case, he could be almost anywhere,